Well, good evening, and welcome to our very first critical conversation. My name is Ashley C. Smith, and I have the honor of serving on the Martin Luther King Holiday Committee. And on behalf of our co-chairs, Mr. Chester Grundy and Councilmember James Brown, we are so honored that you decided to dedicate this time to this very critical conversation. So for 47 years, the Martin Luther King Jr. Holiday Committee has been committed to the life and legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The committee has made it a priority to work to ground the Lexington community and surrounding counties on the life and work of Dr. King, his history, and his commitment to achieving racial justice of national and local voices. So each voice put forth has honored Dr. King and attempted to bring this message forward into our contemporary realities in America. In 2019, the Martin Luther King Jr. Holiday Committee decided it would begin efforts to engage the community in the months leading up to the celebration in January. The first effort along this vein was a co-sponsored free movie screening. 100 Lexington community members came together to view the film Just Mercy, based on the work of Bryan Stevenson. By the end of the movie, our community had a better understanding and were better educated on the injustices facing incarcerated and condemned people in this country. This year, the committee continues its commitment and these efforts by introducing a series of events called Critical Conversations. Critical Conversations will put forth opportunities for Lexington to hear the message of local and national activists, educators, experts, and community leaders as they actively engage in critical work towards justice. The conversation will be an opportunity to generate dialogue and critical thinking about how to create change in systems, our personal lives, and our community. For fall and winter 2020, we will explore topics such as healing racial trauma, exploring economic inclusion through agriculture, and youth-led leadership development. Our first event is tonight. Again, thank you for joining us. This critical conversation will focus on the impact of racial trauma and anti-Black racism. Our featured speaker is an expert and an award-winning psychologist and assistant professor of counseling psychology at the University of Kentucky, Dr. Candice Nicole Hargons. Dr. Hargons is also the founding director of the Center for Healing Racial Trauma. She studies social justice, sex, and leadership, all with a love ethic. She is the founding director of the Center for Healing of Racial Trauma, and her work has been featured in Cosmopolitan, Women's Health, The Huffington Post, Business Insider, and Blavity. She has also written over 25 articles and book chapters on social justice related topics. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our esteemed keynote speaker, Dr. Nicole Hargons.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Ashley, and for inviting me to be the keynote for this critical conversation. It's amazing to be able to speak to your neighbors because this is where the real change happens. And because I love a good teaching moment and I teach through storytelling, I'm going to lead this conversation with 3 stories. They're each going to reflect the levels of racism as outlined by Kamara Jones, a past president of the American Public Health Association. So story 1. For the first 12 years of my life, I was raised in Lockport, a small town outside of Niagara Falls. And it was predominantly white, 83%. And outside of that town, there was the Smoking Joe's Trading Post. Now, Smoking Joe's Trading Post is on the Tuscarora Indian Nation's land and a reservation. And I would pass that every time I went to visit my paternal family members in Niagara Falls, New York. Now, living in this small town, the only thing that I ever learned about the Tuscarora Indian Nation, who likely owned all of that land from Lockport to Niagara Falls the entire time pre-colonization, was sitting Indian style, building teepees, and the story of Pocahontas. For there to be a predominantly white town on unceded lands of indigenous people, for there to be a school curriculum that excludes and omits their history, that is institutional racism. Story 2. A few years ago, I walked into a conference room and sat at a table to prepare for a doctoral dissertation defense. The doctoral student was a Black woman, and if you hadn't already noticed, I am too. But none of the other members of the committee were Black people. So the dissertation chair looked at me as I sat at the table and ate the last bit of my lunch before the dissertation defense began and said, "You're going to have to move so that when we get started, everyone's here." I nodded, finished chewing my Panera, and then the student walked up and said, "No, this is Dr. Hargons. She's the external reviewer on my dissertation committee." So instead of deciding how I wanted to respond in that moment, I had to do the emotional labor of being the only Black faculty member in the room and helping facilitate this student's completion of her doctoral process, and then decide how I wanted to approach the microaggression that I experienced in that moment. So a day or so later, I reached out to my colleague and let her know unequivocally that I had experienced a microaggression and that I wanted her to know what it was so she could do her own personal reflection, but I did not need a reply. She replied anyway, and she apologized again, this time acknowledging the microaggression, which she had yet to do before. And I decided, that was enough. I'm not going to respond. But for a colleague to ask a Black woman to leave the table in her well-earned seat at the table without first asking why she might sit there, that is personally mediated racism. Story 3. I was 25 years old when I could look at the hair that grew out of my scalp as is and find it beautiful. I was 5 years old when someone chemically altered the state of my hair so that I could be more acceptable to white society. So for the bulk of my life, 25 years, I struggled with what is called internalized racism. Now at 37, I love this hair. I love this skin and these Black features. But for 25 years to be preoccupied with what standards of beauty were not associated with the way I look, that is internalized racism. So I want you to sit as you think about three stories, and I'm going to walk you through something I call the SEC model. And since we're in Kentucky, the SEC language is very familiar, but this one is a little bit different. The S stands for sensations. I want you to notice what sensations are occurring in your body as you hear these stories. Check in with your shoulders. Check in with your breathing. Check in with your heart rate. Our bodies are our first source of knowledge. Before we learn the language of emotions, and before we have the intellectual capacity to articulate what those emotions and thoughts are, our bodies communicate who we are and how we experience the world. So when we're having critical conversations about racism, your body is the first sign that you're experiencing the conversation under duress, or that you're willing to get in the game and empathize with someone. So check in if you're holding stress in your body, if you're holding your breath. What does that mean for you? Now I'm going to have you connect with your emotions. And if you grew up in certain communities and certainly certain family styles, then maybe you were socialized to forget your emotions, to suppress them, to minimize them, to get over it, to move past it. But today we're going to bring those into the conversation, because to ignore our emotional capacity is to forego or foreclose on an opportunity to connect and be human. So what emotions came up as you heard those three stories? Was it fear? Was it sadness? Was it anger? Was it rage? Was it apathy? Was it numbness? What emotions do you risk acknowledging aloud, and what emotions do you pretend are not there? When you want to have these conversations, you have to be attuned mindfully to what your emotional state is, because it informs that next level. The E is for cognition. So your cognitions are what you're thinking and also what you're trying not to think. You could be thinking about the laundry list of things you have to do or how you're going to continue to survive COVID. You could also be thinking, but I'm not racist, or yeah, every single piece of that was racist. Your cognitions are how we're socialized to interact with the world through all of these levels of education. So it takes us out of an embodied connection to people's experience and an emotional, empathic experience right into intellectualizing. And sometimes people really stay there when it comes to these conversations. They have an intellectual, philosophical understanding of racism, perhaps, and that's it, without the experiential or connected response. Each of these levels aren't unique. And some people experience all three or one or two. But our research team at the University of Kentucky, the Rye Square research team, undertook a study where we examined how Black students in particular reacted when they were exposed to a vicarious racial harassment stimulus. And what that means is that we let them listen to a self-identified white woman talk about Black people in ways that were pejorative and stereotypical and quite painful. So we connected them to a biometric monitor that gauged their heart rate and heart rate variability. And we had them listen to the audio recording for 5 minutes as we assessed. And what we found is physiologically, they had a stress response listening to this vicarious racial harassment stimulus. So what we know is that their heart rates spiked as if they were experiencing something distressing. And for the many people out there who think racism is just something that people should get over, it's uncomfortable, perhaps maybe just an inconvenience, what we know is that it can erode you physically and mentally from the inside out. And our research and the research of scholars for the past 4 decades have proven this. So when we talk about racial trauma, we're talking about not only hurt feelings, but we're talking about high blood pressure, and we're talking about early mortality, and we're talking about PTSD, and we're talking about major depression. We're talking about physical and mental consequences of being exposed to these 3 levels of racism: the institutional level, the personally mediated level, and even the internalized levels. So once a person is exposed to racism in whatever form it is, they experience what we just named as these race-based stress reactions. So you have the letting out reaction, which is a somatic reaction. People on our research, they cried, some were shaking. Some of them felt tension in their shoulders, had a harder time breathing. They felt their heart racing. And we call these reactions letting out because they were expressing physically some of the consequences of that racist stimulus. We call the next level, the emotional level, sitting with, because whereas many Black people have been socialized for survival to suppress emotion so that they don't upset anyone white and risk violence, these participants express their sadness. They express their apathy, their numbness even, express their anger, their rage. They gave name to that and voice to that. And some participants chose or reacted in a style that we call rising above. And that's the cognitive reaction. So they sought to explain it away, perhaps by understanding or seeking to understand where the woman was coming from when she used this racist language. And some people also use the rising above strategy to distance themselves from the emotional reactions that are stereotypically imposed on Black people. They said, well, I'm not angry. I'm not that type of person. Some of them even drew upon their socioeconomic class privilege and their ability to articulate a really strong argument for why all of the things she was saying was not true. And they used that strategy to minimize or dismantle her argument. I'll acknowledge that that's one of my most favorite strategies to use. But those three reactions can happen together or they can happen separately depending on how severe the racist stimulus is and how frequent they are. And when you have severity and frequency of racism, because it's so chronic, it goes from race-based stress reactions, those more immediate experiences, to race-based stress symptoms, those more long-standing experiences of the negative consequences of racism. So you might find yourself experiencing hypervigilance, where you're always looking around and checking in to see if something was racist. You're trying to protect yourself by being aware. Or you might feel fatigued. And when they're extremely chronic or incredibly frequent, you have racial trauma. This is what you get when you see PTSD symptoms, night sweats and nightmares, waking up thinking about a racist experience that happened to you. Or you might have substance use, where a person is seeking to numb any feelings they have associated with the chronicity and severity of the racism around them. So racial trauma happens on a spectrum, from race-based stress reactions to race-based stress symptoms to racial trauma. And the work we do at the Center for Healing Racial Trauma is to help unpack all sides of that. So we have a prevention arm and we have an intervention arm. And our prevention arm serves to help white organizations and white institutions who are seeking to cultivate an anti-racist mindset and environment to do that work so that we prevent the occurrence of racist stressors in the first place. And the intervention arm is to work with racially or ethnically marginalized people who have experienced some form of racism and all of the other intersecting oppressions that can come with that and compound that, so that they can recover and heal therapeutically. So as I started with 3 stories about racism and the 3 levels, I want to end with 3 stories about healing at all 3 levels. Story 1. I am the mother of a beautiful, brilliant Black baby boy. He's 19 months old, and as we were preparing to enroll him in school, my husband and I had much to consider. We visited several daycare and preschool options with high ratings and solid recommendations, although most of them were still predominantly white. And this made us nervous, given the first story. Since there would be so few people who looked like him, we wondered, would the teachers be able to love him and care for him and understand him? Would the curriculum have people who looked like him and shared his heritage and his culture? We thought about all of these things as we selected Providence Montessori, loving that Montessori approach and noticing that their books did not exclusively center white people, but we were still nervous. But then on June 8th, I breathed a little easier. So in the midst of what the APA, the American Psychological Association, calls a double pandemic, COVID-19 and the ongoing instances of highly publicized racism, Providence sent out a statement to their school family that read, and I'm going to read verbatim. As educators and a community of learners, we feel it is our responsibility to acknowledge recent events caused by ongoing systemic racism and the culminating in protests across all 50 states. We grieve for and celebrate the lives of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. It is a pleasure teaching your children, and their curiosity and generosity give us hope and remind us that nobody is born racist. As questions inevitably arise for your children, please take the time to have these difficult conversations with them, to answer their questions, to listen closely. Below are some links to book recommendations to help facilitate these conversations. As Montessorians, we are committed every day to the same efforts that are reflected in our mission and vision statement, our strategic plan, and our peace curriculum. We thank you for your role in helping us foster an inclusive and actively anti-racist community. We welcome conversation as we continue to expand our efforts. We affirm now and always that Black lives matter. And I nearly cried reading that message because it let me know explicitly where their commitments were aligned in that system. And that doesn't mean it will be perfect, but I don't need perfection. I understand that dismantling systems of racism is a journey. It's a long game. But for my son, I do need anti-racism to be in the systemic purpose of any organization I allow to train him and socialize him. And that is what organizational and structural healing looks like. Story 2. As you may recall, when I emailed my colleague about the doctoral dissertation defense microaggression, I said I did not need a reply. I was hurt and frankly insulted, so I needed time to process that. I never responded to her unsolicited follow-up apology, but what I noticed is that she shifted. Although her initial reaction had some defensiveness, she didn't shrink from the feedback I provided. She didn't move into paralyzing guilt and shame, which serves no one. She made sure that if something good about me was announced through the university, she reached out in congratulations. She attempted to stay in relationship consistently, willing to learn. And she joined a group of colleagues who were actively enhancing their commitment to anti-racism for her personal growth. Those initial attempts to repair were consistent and undeterred by my tone. She didn't tone police me, but she was never pushy about expecting me to help her feel more comfortable with her actions. The willingness to be accountable about your racist socialization and repair as many times as you get it wrong without expecting racially marginalized people to preserve your comfort or your illusion of innocence, that is personally mediated healing. Last story. As you can see, the first 2 stories involved work white people need to do to fix a broken racist system and repair the racist ruptures that intentional and unintentional beliefs and actions can cause. But story 3 is for the global majority, the 84% of the world who are people of color, especially those of us impacted by racism and colonialism and imperialism. So in 2016, I created the Black Lives Matter Meditation for Healing Racial Trauma. I created it because I needed it. Having watched Philando Castile be murdered with his girlfriend and daughter in the car. I had trained to use mind-body therapy strategies at the Emory University Stress Clinic while I was on doctoral internship, finishing up my last year at the University of Georgia. And I knew it was time to apply the knowledge to healing racial trauma. I shared it with my psychology colleagues, and I will admit I felt incredibly vulnerable. When you create something and put it out into the world, you never know what you're going to get back. But, eventually the Huffington Post picked it up and they did a feature story on it, and it was shared nationally. I was invited to several organizations to facilitate training on anti-racism and healing racial trauma. And building on that work, I'm proud to say last year, we founded the Center for Healing Racial Trauma, where we provide therapy for racially and ethnically marginalized people on a sliding scale. And what that means is we never have to turn anyone away for the inability to pay, because we also provide consultation and training on anti-racist culture and environment development for organizations. I now have the honor of working with activists and organizers and students and community members of color who are undoing and divesting from the injury caused by racism. We talk about how resistance and activism are healing. We talk about how joy is resistance. We talk about how rest is resistance, and how to create a care praxis that sustains your wellness as you continue to dismantle these systems daily. We also talk about how to affirm yourself daily, specifically targeting racist messages that you were socialized to believe about yourself by using counter messages that emphasize our inherent value and worthiness. It is an honor to do this work. So I'm going to have you check in once again using the SEC model. As you think about these 3 out of many ways of healing at the institutional and personally mediated and internalized level, I want you to check in with your body. Take a deep breath and see what you notice. What sensations are there? Without judgment, simply noticing them. How is your breathing? How are your shoulders, your jawline, your back, your head, all the places we traditionally carry stress? How's your gut? No judgment for what you're feeling, just notice it. Let's move to the E. Check in with your emotions. Give them a little room, a little airtime. What do you notice? And you can use any emotion word that comes to mind. They're all valid. And that doesn't mean we choose action based on our emotion, but just that we acknowledge them, that we don't seek to suppress them to pretend as if we aren't emotional beings. Maybe you feel some hope. Maybe you feel some anger still. All of it is valid. And lastly, what are your cognitions? What's on your mind? As you think about radical possibilities for resistance, as you think about all the opportunities and options you have for changing the system into the type of place where we feel comfortable sending our children to school and walking through our neighborhoods, where we can talk to each other and recognize that even though we will mess up because we're human, we recognize how to repair. What are the thoughts that come to mind with these possibilities at the forefront? That's what you want to go into the next time you engage in a critical conversation. So I want to name this. Before anything, Black Lives Matter is an affirmation. But it's also a global movement, and it supports the interventions that align with how to transform that affirmation into action. Let your conversation be a first step toward action and not just talk. The movement for Black Lives supports the rights of immigrants and people who are disabled or differently abled, and people who are lesbian, gay, or bisexual, or transgender, or intersex, or anything on the queer plus spectrum. And also for people who are elders and youth, people who are big-bodied, fat, curvy, all of these bodies, all of these lives that we systematically have discarded. That's what the movement for Black Lives is about, reclaiming and honoring the affirmation of their inherent worthiness. So I want to leave you with the understanding that this work is intersectional and intentional, and that healing racial trauma is ongoing, long-term, and you need sustainable commitment to be able to do it well. So I thank you for listening, and now I'm looking forward to hearing your questions, engaging in this conversation.
I am completely blown away, Dr. Candice. You are a brilliant, intellectual, wise, beyond your years leader.
Thank you.
And so I hope our audience was able to distill after you picked up your jaw and reflect on some of the next steps that we can take. And so I will turn here to our chat and let's have a conversation. Let's really dig deep into our own personal, internalized, institutionalized ways that we've been affected ourselves, or we've perpetuated these issues onto others. We want to be able to open up this conversation and reflect what was really standing out to you. What were you hearing? You know, the systemic purpose that Providence Montessori, they took the step as an institution to open their doors fully and acknowledge the spectrum.
Yeah.
And they weren't paralyzed by guilt and shame.
Mm-hmm.
So you offered us a lot of tangibles that allow racialized individuals and our white community members to be able to come to the forefront, come to the table,
Yes,
and meet in the middle. So let's open it up. Okay, let's go to the chat. When you think of this work, what is the one experience that kind of sustains you, that gives you life? Because this work can be very daunting and eroding.
Yes.
So how do you personally take care of yourself?
Okay, that's two questions.
Okay, two questions. So what sustains you?
What sustains me when I do this work, those moments, and also how do I take care of myself? Right. What sustains me is when people who have racially or ethnically marginalized identities come to me as one of few in their organizations when I've done a training and say, I feel seen. I feel validated. I don't feel like I'm crazy anymore. I don't feel like I'm alone in the way I understand the world. I feel heard. I feel worthy. That for me is what sustains me, because I am, contrary to popular opinion, quite an introvert. So when I'm engaging in a group of 200 people or 300 people doing this, when I tell you I have to take a 4.5-hour nap afterward, that is real. It's exhausting. But those are the things that anchor me. Those moments where someone comes to me in gratitude, like, man, I needed this to keep working here, or I needed this to stay in this community. That sustains me. Now, how do I sustain myself? I'm still working on it, to be honest. I just told my husband the other day, I was like, we need to get an elliptical machine and put it in the bedroom so that as soon as I step foot out of the bed, I have no excuse but to go work out, because I know that this is somatic embodied work that I'm doing, the therapy and the prevention work. And so I carry it in my body. I feel it in my shoulders right now. Yeah. I feel it in my stomach and in my chest. And I have to stay physically well to prevent that erosion. So eating well, sleeping, taking good cuddle time, like making sure that my son and my husband and I get to cuddle with each other, seeing him laugh, all of those things are the ways that I engage and sustain myself. I also like to journal and, of course, meditate. So those are some of the ways I sustain myself. And also some recommendations I give to clients when they ask me, how do I keep surviving? How do I keep thriving? I'm like, well, what's your care practice look like? And usually it's numbing. So we hear a lot about self-care. And when people say self-care, what they tend to mean is I'm numbing out. So I'm binge watching Netflix, or I'm binge drinking, or I'm binge eating. I'm not doing things that are facilitating my wellness, but helping me feel soothed and comforted momentarily. I don't knock it. You need a little bit of that, because this stuff is very painful, but you also need exercise and good sleep. You also need community and collective care. You need people who love you, loving on you, and you need to give love. And doing resistance work is also a part of that. So all of those are how I put together a care practice that keeps me going, but I am quite tired.
We're starting to get some questions into the chat here. Throughout history, we have felt and seen brinks of change. How will we know when change has truly occurred, in your opinion?
I think that change for me is going to be defined differently than it is for other people, but I always believe in having a vision of the world I want to see. So I have this research project. It's called How to Love a Human. And I ask people with a variety of marginalized identities, what would the world look like if it loved you? Well, as a qualitative researcher, I always ask myself those questions first. And one thing people can say about me across my lifespan, all 37 of these years, is that I have big vision. So I know what the world that I want to live in looks like. That's why I'm actively working toward it. It's a world where the curriculum that is in schools is robust enough to hold the accomplishment and the advancements and the beauty and the heritage of all people. It's a world where we walk through our neighborhoods and neighbors treat each other with respect and care and not paternalistic surveillance. It's a world where we can get it wrong with each other and not shrink back or get defensive in shame and lash out in shame, but where we can be accountable to the injuries we've made and to say, I need to repair this because you're important to me. I understand that I'm connected to you. And when I injure you, I injure myself. Mm-hmm. Some very like homegrown, down to earth, indigenous practices that we have had historically that we've gotten away from. And so it looks like a world where all forms of beauty are represented in media. All ways of loving are represented in media. It looks like a world where business leadership and political leadership is socioeconomically diverse, is racially diverse, is sexually diverse, is body diverse. Like there's so many different ways of showing up human in this world. And we have such a narrow power structure. And that's by design. The world I want to live in is one where those pieces are gradually made more equitable. If I had a magic wand, it would be immediately, but I recognize how humans work and how policy works. And so I understand it's a long suffering process, unfortunately, but it's one that when we're committed to the work, it sustains us to keep pushing the needle forward.
Brilliant. When people say Black Lives Matter, why do you think most people outside of the Black community or maybe inside the Black community automatically think they're saying there's a devaluation of other races?
I don't think people actually think that. I think they just don't like affirmation of Black lives. So if you're committed to seeing the movement for Black lives in a way that says no other people matter, I think you're committed to a certain type of ignorance and a certain type of insulation from the variety of ways of seeing the world, because the movement for Black lives has a website and a web presence, and they're very clear about who they support and who they love and who they affirm. And it's a very broad group of people. It's a very inclusive movement. If you ever show up at a protest, you're going to see people of all racial and ethnic identities. You're going to see people of all ages. It's a movement that embraces the multitude. So if a person is choosing, and it's a choice to see it that way, then, you know, they're just at an earlier stage in their racial identity development, and they're going to need, and if they're, you know, if they're white people in particular, they're going to need other white people who are more advanced to bring them along, because there's not going to be any amount of convincing I can do for them. And I think that would probably be a waste of energy to try to argue it. If I know Black Lives Matter, it's not an argument for me. It's not philosophical for me. It's a reality and a lived existence. And I think that when they're ready to move into that way of understanding, they will. And that's usually through solidarity with other white accomplices and allies who can stay in the game with them.
That's great. I'm going to back to the chat. Sorry.
No problem.
Okay, here we go. Bear with me, y'all. We're all zoomed out, but we're doing this production.
That's so real.
So
there
was a question about, you know, ending the, how does one end systematic racism? How do we sustain that change? How do you sustain it? Because there's a great question from Mr. Grundy that talks about, unpacks the white racial rage has a cyclical nature, you know? So if it's cyclical and you know it's gonna
come around,
then how do you sustain this longevity?
I don't think that it's creative, but I do think it's cyclical, if that makes sense. So the strategies of racism are not thoughtful, creative interventions. They are using similar strategies at different time points policy, people, policy, and people, violence, verbally and physically. Like those things happen throughout time. So if we know that, our strategy for resistance has to step at every single one of those levels. We've got grassroots movements going on, and we've got people who are intentionally infiltrating at all levels of policy. Like we need to see that as the approach, something multifaceted. And so that when it morphs, you have people who preempted the morph, people who named what was coming politically. And we have to be able to believe these people and recognize how credible they are, because people with racially and ethnically marginalized identities are insightful about how these systems have transformed and flipped and been cyclical. But sometimes their knowledge making and their knowledge sharing is suppressed. What I love about this era is that we have access to media outlets that disseminate information immediately. And it's about which media outlets you follow. Those that have an international presence sometimes aren't the ones that are going to cast the movement making in the way it needs to be cast for it to be sustainable. But if you're following people at the grassroots who are sharing things on IG and who are sharing things on Twitter and who are from the front lines telling you how tear gas is being used, if they're from the front lines telling you this judge has been appointed in this area and it's going to mean this, if they're telling you from organizational leadership, these people have pushed against the anti-racism culture that this other group is trying to enforce or trying to instill, then you can be strategic about how you intervene at all those levels. So it takes people who are committed to the long game. It takes creative and radical hope approaches, and it takes intention to stay with it and to not give racism that much credit, because it's not creative. But the cycle will continue if we're not working together in community to be at all of those levels of intervention.
So the kind of second piece of the event title tonight is talking about anti-Black racism, which is, you know, as American as apple pie.
Yes.
How do you really tackle anti-Black racism in its deeply embedded forms? You know, how do you approach that? What is the first step that you can take in helping dismantle that?
Yeah. I think anti-Black racism comes from the people who enforce its deep sense of impotence and incompetence and inferiority. Because you don't have to make other people a scapegoat or push anyone else down if you feel truly competent and worthy and valuable. But it also comes from contempt and disgust. So the way we cast stereotypes about Black people in this country has been used to explain away the dehumanization process that has been imposed on Black people, from kidnapping human beings, taking them from their children and taking them from their parents, from brutalizing and terrorizing human beings, cutting their flesh open, scalping people, cutting feet off. I mean, these are real atrocities that have happened. And to resolve the cognitive dissonance that comes up when you treat another human being that way, you have to create all kinds of lies, all kinds of myths about them. And so to dehumanize someone is to take the contempt and disgust that you should have for yourself in that brutalization and to impose it on the other. And I think that's how anti-Blackness functions in the United States. There's a scapegoat through which people can say, well, at least I'm better than, as opposed to we're all in this together and we have a shared human experience that we could align with if we chose love, if we chose a love ethic. It says for people to come into the country and to receive any resource, you have to align with anti-Blackness. You have to dehumanize Black people to earn your place in whiteness sometimes. So we saw this with people who are Irish and people who are Scottish, people who were Italian even, before they were believed to be white people. They had to, through the proxy of anti-Blackness, move into whiteness, as opposed to being welcomed into it. There had to be a commitment to that type of violence and that type of dehumanization evidenced. So we see how it's been done with, I say this all the time in the Commonwealth, we see this how it's been done with white people who are poor. White people who have been poor for generations have been co-opted into this identity of whiteness that still doesn't serve them. And have used anti-Blackness to feel, well, at least I have someone that I'm better than, as opposed to really pairing with people and partnering in the way that Martin Luther King originally wanted it to be. And the Poor People's Campaign strives for still, to say, you know, as opposed to distancing myself from this body that we've been taught to contempt, I could align with them because we would make up the majority and really have some power to change a system. I see that used in all of these communities throughout Appalachia who remain poor, who are not served by the interests of the political class, but still feel tied to this aspiration of whiteness. So I think anti-Black racism has served as a gateway through which people receive resources and access and proximity to power. And if we thought about distributing power more equitably, more carefully, more lovingly even, more intentionally, we wouldn't have to use it, but we're still in that place where it's used and common and familiar in the world. And so that means that white people and other people of color adopt anti-Blackness sometimes to distance themselves from contempt and from the violence that's imposed upon Black people and Black bodies.
And so, yeah, we want to stay right there. So how can non-Black people of color hold themselves accountable? Because again, we had an earlier conversation about that triangulation, wanting to have that access to whiteness or the white racial frame. So, you know, we are proud to have a very diverse audience this evening, and we do have some individuals coming from other communities of color. So what message can you direct towards them and where they need to be owning and holding themselves accountable in anti-Black racism?
I think if we were to be on each other's team, we could do this a lot faster. Hear that message first. If people with racially and ethnically marginalized identities were on each other's team, we could do this first. But when you use Blackness as a vehicle to gain access to higher education and to class privilege and to resources, and you choose to leave Black people in that position, you invest in dehumanization. And that deteriorates you. So if you think about colorism in Asian communities, in Latinx communities, how in Brazil, for example, there are 17 variations of people of color who are distancing themselves from the different types of Black, like their Black heritage or Black lineage. When you think about people using skin bleaching creams, I was watching Indian Matchmaker, and who is fair is going to be selected as a marriage partner first before someone who is dark. Like, these are the ways that you might want to examine how anti-Blackness is in your community. If you're associating darkness with worthlessness or devaluation, then you probably have some endorsement of anti-Blackness. And I always say this when I'm doing these trainings, this isn't about guilt and shame, because your guilt and shame serve no one. I don't need anyone to spend 6 months wallowing in, oh my goodness, I've been a terrible person and what am I to do? Who is that serving but your own ego? Moving into a space where you're accountable to it and saying, yeah, I did buy into that. I bought into it as a Black person because I'm socialized in a system that says certain types of skin, certain types of hair, certain identities are not valuable. So you're not special for buying into it. Recognizing what it is, though, and developing your critical consciousness about the purpose that it serves and whose power it preserves is how you take that first step. So when you recognize that you too could be on the chopping block, despite your commitment to anti-Blackness, despite your endorsement of values that typically don't even serve your community beyond mere minor distribution of resources, then you can start to see what power you have when you align with the masses, with the rest of the global majority. So I think that's my main message, that we are stronger together, more thoughtful together, more brilliant together, more creative together. And I welcome that connection. I welcome that community. I welcome anyone who's invested in dismantling anti-Blackness in themselves first, and then with others at large.
So I hear we have 5 minutes left.
Okay.
Right? Four now.
4 minutes left.
We're going to do some really quick questions, like one answer.
Okay.
One word answers. All right. So you said that racism is not creative. It's absolutely not creative. Dr. Hargons, do you believe that it is a disease or a choice?
Both.
Okay. What role do you think religious institutions have to play in the undergirding of racial trauma and anti-Black racism, where it's kind of been used as a tool, a weapon to justify? This is not a one.
It's not.
Okay, this is what we're gonna do.
Okay.
He got really deep. So we're gonna email you his question,
Okay.
and then you can break that down. Love you with, but okay.
I can give you a brief answer on
okay,
that.
Great.
I think religious institutions have a lot of power, and they could use it for love.
Yes,
They have not used it well yet.
that's right.
Mm-hmm.
And that'll preach
That.
all the way. What about Lovecraft Country? Have you
Yes,
watched
I like
that?
it a lot.
All right, Ms. Tony King, she has watched it, and have you taken in the 5th episode?
No, I have not.
Okay, so that sounds like it centers around whiteness, and the representation of the racial trauma within that series is profound.
I'm going to watch it tonight.
Listen, everyone, we really appreciate you being here with us this evening. Continue to leave your questions in the chat, and we can get those to Dr. Hargons, and upon her availability, she'll be able to reach back out to you. But our last question that I want to leave you with, it's not a one-word answer.
Okay.
You spoke earlier in your talk about gaining access to strategies and techniques to better deal with and manage our reaction responses to racism that we encounter. Perhaps it's the care practices you were referring to, amongst your many strategies. So would you kind of leave us with that final thought?
All right. So strategy number 1, attune to your body. Your body is going to communicate before you have language, before your emotion does, what you're feeling, and trust it. Your body's still a trusted source of knowledge. That doesn't mean you have to act out of it. But for people of color in particular, when you walk into a room and your shoulders get tight and you can't breathe, that's communicating something to you. Pay attention to it. You can take some deep breaths. I believe in breath work, believe in guided meditation and meditation as a practice. I believe in dance and joy. I don't know if you were with Patty and Gladys last night, but I believe in joy as resistance and community building. Those are some of the strategies that we have historically and currently used to keep surviving and thriving despite racism. So that resilience is still embedded in you. Tap into that and then reach out for therapy. Because this isn't work that you can do alone, and this isn't healing that you can do alone. It really does need to be done in partnership and community.
Again, we thank Dr. Candice Nicole Hargons for her expertise, her intellect, and wisdom in leading this profound conversation. So let's give her a round of applause over Zoom.
Thank you.
And as we mentioned in our introduction, this is the first of a 3-part series. Again, we are so glad that you joined us for Critical Conversations. And now we invite you to save the date. We want you to save the date for Monday, November 16th from 6 to 7:30. This conversation is called Planting and Harvesting Our Future, Blacks in Food and Agricultural Entrepreneurship. It will feature keynote Kelly James, founder and CEO of Macaris. Macaris is an ag tech startup that provides market information and an online marketplace for organic crops. James is a University of Kentucky alumnus and a 2009 Barack Obama White House Fellow. She recently co-founded the Freedman Heirs Foundation. an organization that provides support to new and existing Black farmers. We look forward to you joining us in this incredible follow-up conversation happening on Monday, November 16th at 6 p.m. Much like you registered and participated this evening, we'll put up an Eventbrite registration and then we'll send the Zoom link out closer to the event date. Again, we thank Dr. Candice Nicole. We thank the MLK Holiday Committee. We thank Mark Mahan and Lily Rochelle of Mahan Multimedia Studios here in Lexington. And we're so pleased to be broadcasting live in this great studio here in the Meadowthorpe community. So take what you've learned today and don't sit on it. Make it real, affirm, make it tangible, and we will see you in November. Until then, be blessed and stay well.